If you're having a good time listening to Bradbury 100, please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101. And don't forget to visit my website at bradburymedia.co.uk. This is Bradbury 100, celebrating the life and works of American writer Ray Bradbury. Hello and welcome to another in my Chronological Bradbury series, where I'm working through Ray's stories in the order they were originally published. If you've listened before, you will have heard me talk about stories written from 1938 through to 1942. And so now we move on to the year 1943. It's quite logical, isn't it, really? 1943 is a record year for Ray Bradbury. He has more stories published this year than in any previous year. 11 stories all told. So he's averaging nearly one a month. That's a huge increase on the previous year when he only had 2 stories published. Every single one of his 1943 stories was a true professional sale. And 1943 sees him continue his association with Weird Tales magazine and Astounding Science Fiction magazine, and to begin selling to a whole load of other magazines, such as Startling Stories, Thrilling Wonder Stories, and Famous Fantastic Mysteries. Yes, all of these are pulp magazines, and many of Ray's stories in this year, frankly, are as pulpy as they come. But he is also developing rapidly as a writer, and so we'll see some absolute classics turning up in this year. So, let's get started with The Piper. The Piper was a story which Ray originally published in his own fanzine, Futuria Fantasia, back in 1940, and I spoke about that one in some detail in podcast episode number 49. His revised professional version of The Piper was published in Thrilling Wonder Stories in February 1943. It's never appeared in any of Ray's own main short story collections, but it has been anthologized a few times over the years, and you will find it in the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 1. I'm not going to rehash everything that I said back in episode 49, but in brief, the original version of The Piper was about a Venusian on Mars who uses his music to rouse the native Martians into revolting against the colonizing humans, driving them off the planet. The whole series of events in that version of the story is witnessed by an old human and a young Martian, and their dialogue gives us nearly all the information we need. So, what do you think Ray might have done when he developed this 4-page amateur original into the 14-page revised professional version of The Piper? Do you think maybe he simply padded the story with additional plot? No, of course not. The revised version of The Piper begins with our title character, who now has a name. He's called Karak, and this time he's not a Venusian, he is himself a Martian, and we see him arrive back on Mars on board a Jovian spaceship. Unlike the original version of The Piper, where the title character is just a silhouette seen on a distant hill, we are with the title character all through this version of the story. So Ray has shifted the point of view in order to make the story more dramatic, more engaging. We didn't know much about the original Piper, as he was just a mythical figure seen only from a distance. But in this revised version, we see that Karak is an angry, vengeful character. Ray also gives us more detail on different types of Martian. In the original version of the story, we know only that most Martians have retreated to the caves in the hills and devolved. Only when the Piper plays his music, and only after he's been doing this for years, do the Martians finally stir and rebel. Now, in the revised version of the story, Ray gives us more detail. Martians are clearly of two types. There's the golden race, which Kerak the Piper is part of, and there's the dark race. They're the ones who've retreated to the darkness of the caves. It's a very Wellesian idea. It's just like the Eloi and the Morlocks in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. Speaking of time travel, if we jump out of the chronological Bradbury timeline just for a moment, we can also see that Ray's concept of the Martians being of different races is something that survives right through to his 1950 book, The Martian Chronicles. Although the Piper isn't really consistent with the Chronicles does have the city-dwelling Martians who are studied by Spender, and the blue ghostly ones, the separate race or species or type, which is encountered by Father Peregrine in the story The Fire Balloons. And there's another bit of a Martian Chronicles precursor in the Piper, which you'll find in both the amateur and the professional versions of the story, and that is the despoiling of Mars. In the amateur version, human industry has wrecked and polluted the Martian landscape. In the professional version, Kerak has been away from Mars for 20 years and is horrified to see what the colonizers have done to his home planet. This reaction prefigures the character of Spender in And the Moon Be Still as Bright, The Martian Chronicles, who is mortified at the thought that what remains of the Martian civilization will be desecrated by people like fellow crew member Sam Parkhill. However, in the professional version of the Piper, it's not humans who have conquered and colonized Mars. It's Jovians, creatures from Jupiter. And this feels like Ray is chickening out of a very strong theme. The earlier version of the story observed that humans claim ownership of anything they fancy and then destroy any beauty it may have had. But the professional version of the story lets us off the hook by transferring the villainy onto a whole other species, the Jovians. Fortunately, when Ray put the Martian Chronicles together, he ensured that the book was all about us, about our hopes and our dreams and our fears and our tendency to destroy. All of it, the whole package. The 1943 professional version of the Piper is generally a much better story than the more brief amateur version, but it is as pulpy as can be. And if it's worth reading at all, it's to see some of those early ideas about Mars, which would later coalesce in the Martian Chronicles. The second of Ray's stories published in 1943 is quite a well-known one, The Wind. This appeared in Weird Tales in March 1943, and it was only Ray's second appearance in Weird Tales. In the previous year, he'd appeared in its pages with The Candle. The Wind went into Ray's first book, Dark Carnival, in 1947, and today you can find it there, as well as in the books The October Country and Bradbury Stories. However, all those book appearances carry a revised version of The Wind. The one published in Weird Tales is different. In the Weird Tales version, Ray introduces us to a character called John Colt, evidently an explorer and an expert in winds and storms, who tries to lock himself away from a wind that he is convinced is out to get him. As he does battle with the breezes that rattle his doors and windows, he phones a friend, Thompson, who is unable to come and help him. Oh, and spoiler, by the end of the story, Colt has made a noose and has tried to hang himself, only for the wind to intervene and to cause the rafters of his roof to collapse. The original text of this story is available in only one book, and that's the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, Critical Edition, Volume 1. In preparing Dark Carnival, which was Ray's first short story collection, published in 1947, Ray thoroughly revised The Wind. In fact, it's the only story in the book that was heavily revised. But there are some other stories which had minor revisions. In rewriting, he took a step back. Instead of presenting the events from Colt's point of view, he presents the entire story from the point of view of the friend, Thompson. Thompson keeps receiving these nervous phone calls from his apparently paranoid friend, who is now renamed Alin, by the way. And although the same basic events take place in the story, we experience the whole thing through the eyes of Thompson, the normal family man who is faced with dealing with Alin's madness. Until, of course, it turns out that Alin probably wasn't paranoid. The wind probably was actually out to get him. I say probably because in both versions of the story we end with this spooky, ambiguous situation. Maybe the wind really did get Colt or Alin, or maybe it didn't. Either way, there's a chilly wind out there right now. Taking the two stories together, or rather the two versions of the story together, provides a masterclass in the management of point of view. The Weird Tales version of the story is a very good tale, and the revised version that you'll find in all the books is also a very good tale. But it has the edge because of the heightened sense of paranoia, which ultimately transfers from one character to another. To me, The Wind is in that same category as The Crowd, Skeleton, and The Fruit at the Bottom of the Bowl. They're all to do with paranoia, and most of them are to do with obsession. The fact that Ray returned to these themes over and over, and also invested so much time and energy into revising these stories, suggests to me that he knew when he was onto a good thing from a storytelling point of view, and possibly that he was obsessive about telling the story right. In the revised version, Ray also builds the character of Thompson's wife. While Thompson is somewhat concerned about Alin and his wind obsession, Mrs. Thompson comes across as the logical one, the voice of reason and sanity. She just wants Thompson to hang up the phone and get back to some proper socialising at their card game. Given that the more familiar revised version of The Wind consists largely of conversations held over the phone, you'd think it might make a good radio play. Yeah, it did. In 1949, it was dramatised by Harry Junkin for NBC's Radio City Playhouse. And in 1984, Mike McDonough produced a modern stereo sound-designed adaptation for his series Bradbury 13. And in 1997, Brian Sibley dramatised it for the BBC's Tales of the Bizarre. It was also adapted for TV by Ray himself for a 1989 episode of Ray Bradbury Theatre. Through a quirk of US copyright law, the original magazine version of The Wind entered the public domain in 1971 or thereabouts. It was eligible for copyright renewal in that year, its 28th year. However, Weird Tales was defunct at that point, and a whole batch of stories from the magazine just didn't get renewed. And because of this, The Wind is freely available for anyone to reproduce. I'll give you a link to a copy of that issue of Weird Tales in the show notes on my blog, bradburymedia.co.uk, so you can take a look for yourself. But also, in the next episode of this podcast, I'll do a reading of the story. Next up in 1943, story number 3 of that year, Gabriel's Horn, co-written with Henry Hassey. Now this one was published in the magazine called Captain Future in spring 1943. And apart from that magazine appearance, the story can only be found in one place, and that's the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 1. It's evidently a story which Ray had no interest in preserving for posterity. Captain Future was a pulp magazine, but a bit different to most of the others. As you might expect from the name, it mainly featured stories about a character called Captain Future. He was a super scientist who would engage in space opera adventures. And according to the magazine's title banner, he was variously a wizard of science or a man of tomorrow. Most issues of Captain Future would feature a novel-length story, and most of these were written by Ray Bradbury's good friend Edmund Hamilton, who incidentally would later marry Ray's other good friend, Lee Brackett. But Captain Future also published short fiction which was not connected to the title character, and this is how Ray got into its pages with Gabriel's Horn. Ray wrote several stories with Henry Hassey in 1941. The first one to sell was The Pendulum, which came out in that year and which I discussed in an earlier episode of the podcast. Then came this one, Gabriel's Horn, which apparently sold in 1941, but it took 2 years to see print. The last collaboration with Henry Hassey also circulated for several years before finally seeing print in 1946, so I'll cover that one when we finally get to that year. Gabriel's Horn is the story of a primitive tribe which is resisting invaders. The invaders are armed with rifles, they have wristwatches, they have torches or flashlights if you prefer. The hero of the story is referred to throughout as Gab, G-A-B, which, well, presumably is short for Gabriel. He's in a power struggle with a rival who is called Moon, spelled M-U-H-N. In fighting the invaders, Gab and Moon come to some level of respect for each other. The invaders are resisted with the aid of a powerful trumpet which Gab has obtained. He, and then Moon, are able to blow this horn so powerfully that the invaders retreat. The reader will probably assume that Gab's uncivilized tribe is somewhere on Earth, and the invaders are possibly Western colonizers, but there are some indications that this is a post-apocalyptic story, that Gab and his tribe are descendants of some former civilization. The story moves along at quite a pace, and the visual storytelling is terrific. The characters are handled well, but ultimately it's just a pulp adventure story, and creatively weaker than stories that Ray was actually writing in 1943. Remember, this story was written 2 years before, and was written in collaboration. Ray had come some way as a writer in those 2 years. Nevertheless, Gabriel's Horn is an enjoyable read. Just don't approach it expecting Bradburian poetry or psychological depth or rich themes, because, well, it's not that kind of story. But it's okay. Four months into 1943, and we come to the fourth Bradbury story published in that year, and it's Subterfuge, which appeared in Astonishing Stories in April 1943. This is about Venusians invading Earth, and the Earth people, knowing they cannot possibly fight off the alien enemy, devising a means for our species to survive. The Venusians turn up, and they find there's nobody here, just the odd stray dog or cat, and then they head off home. apparently leaving us alone forever after. It's quite a corny, pulpy science fiction idea, and not that far removed from the semi-professional stories Ray was writing just a couple of years earlier. But it does show Ray having a much firmer grasp of language. Now, he hasn't quite become the poet of the pulps at this point, but he's showing signs of being able to rise above his fanzine origins. Subterfuge has never turned up in any of Ray's main collections, and it's only been anthologized a couple of times. You will find it in Collected Stories, a critical edition, Volume 1, and you can find scans of the original magazine appearance on the internet. I'll give you a link to that in the show notes. Because so few people have read this story, I'm kind of reluctant to shout out a spoiler without a warning. So if you think you might want to read Subterfuge without spoilers, stop listening now and come back in maybe 30 seconds when the spoiler will be over. Okay, here's the spoiler. To survive the Venusian invasion, a select proportion of the Earth's population are reduced to pure intellect and placed inside the minds of dogs. Yep, you heard me. People stored in dogs. This may be the reason Ray never had this story in any of his collections. In May 1943, we get to The Crowd, which was published in Weird Tales. Weird Tales is rapidly becoming the place that you would find the classier Bradbury stories, the ones with a theme, a philosophy, some sound psychology, as opposed to those science fictional pulps which tended to have those more gimmicky, more tropey stories. If The Wind was the first strong story to emerge from Ray's typewriter, The Crowd is his first masterpiece. By this time, he's been publishing in magazines for 5 years, and he's been writing for over a decade. He's developed a technique of writing every day, and it's begun to pay off. The Crowd was later collected in Ray's first book, Dark Carnival. That's in 1947, and it was a collection of dark fantasy stories published by Arkham House. The version in Dark Carnival is a revised version with many changes of I would say a poetic nature, which demonstrate Ray's enormous power not just as a writer, but a rewriter. We saw this earlier with The Wind, where Ray tells a great story in the original magazine appearance, but miraculously improves it when rewriting it for book publication. In the case of The Wind, the improvement comes largely from totally reconsidering the point of view. With The Crowd, though, the changes are more in the descriptive language, the poetry of the story, and how it's linked to the protagonist. John Eller and Bill Touponce's book, Ray Bradbury, The Life of Fiction, reproduces a short passage of the revised version side by side with the original text, which lets you see the type of considered revisions that Ray made. I'll put an image from that in the show notes so you can see what I mean. The Crowd, either version of the story, is one of Ray's finest compositions. The story gives us a character who becomes intrigued by a crowd that gathers around a car crash. Later, he happens to witness another car crash and sees the very same crowd. Not just the same type of crowd, but the exact same crowd. Investigating, he finds that this crowd has been around for a very, very long time. And eventually, spoilers, our hero himself is in a car crash. And guess who turns up? The Crowd is one of Ray's most reprinted stories. Not only is it in Dark Carnival, it's carried over into The October Country, the book which is itself essentially a revision of Dark Carnival. You'll also find it in the Stories of Ray Bradbury and in Collected Stories, a Critical Edition, Volume 1. And it was adapted for radio, as I discussed in my episode on the radio series Suspense. And Ray dramatised it himself for Ray Bradbury Theatre on TV. And it's even been ripped off a few times by other writers. It's powerful, it's memorable, and it's high concept. And the crowd is essential Bradbury. Now we come to July 1943 and Weird Tales magazine once again, which featured Ray's story, The Scythe, still today considered one of his most haunting stories. It would later appear, slightly revised, in his first book, Dark Carnival, and again in the October Country, and again in the Stories of Ray Bradbury. In this story, a family takes over a farm and inherits a scythe. The father goes out to cut the wheat. His family die, and he keeps on doing it. He is the Grim Reaper. Ray wrote this story during the Second World War, of course, and, well, in the view of my friend and fellow Bradbury scholar, the late Bill Touponce, he, quotes, expands the traditional figure, i.e. the Grim Reaper, to include all the horrors of modern mechanized warfare. In the original version of the story, published in Weird Tales, the protagonist is called Tom Yorg, or at least that's how I pronounce it, spelled Joerg. But in the revised version, he's called Drew Erickson. I don't know why Ray changed the name, but Tom Yorg sounds to me a bit like a Steinbeck character. Ray did have some assistance on this story, which came from his good friend Lee Brackett, herself a successful writer of science fiction, fantasy, and Hollywood screenplays. The Big Sleep, The Empire Strikes Back, to name but two, as you will recall if you heard my earlier episode about Lee. Lee wrote the opening 500 words or so of The Scythe, apparently because Ray was struggling to provide an appropriate narrative frame for the story. And frankly, it's impossible to see the join. Where Brackett leaves off and Bradbury picks up is seamless. Well, we're just over halfway through the year 1943, and already in this year we've encountered 3 Bradbury stories which I would consider among his very best. The Wind, especially in its revised version, is an astonishing tale of obsession. The Crowd, in both its original version and its revised version, is another astonishing tale of obsession. And The Scythe is an astonishing tale of loss, duty, torment. The plotting of all 3 of these stories is excellent. The characterization in all 3 is remarkable. And in all 3 of them, the plot and the characterization are intimately woven to explore a theme. And the themes aren't just personal themes to those characters or that author. They are timeless themes. So these stories are about individuals, but they're also about humanity. And as Bradbury scholar George Slusser pointed out, these early Bradbury weird tales are often about characters who, for some supernatural reason, find themselves singled out, taken out of our mundane world. This is how George Slusser characterises these stories, which he says have strong Calvinist overtones. He writes, "The world, in a sense, is divided into elect and non-elect. Common men misunderstand both nature and their place in it. The hero sees. But vision, it seems, is both election and curse. The nature he perceives is depraved. Some dark original sin has woven evil into its very fabric. It is as if he were destined, because he sees the true state of things and cannot accept it, to endure the most fearful punishments, not the least of which is unbearable isolation in his knowledge, solitary guilt. A perfect summing up there from George Slusser. These 3 stories alone would place Bradbury soundly among other authors of the supernatural. He can sit alongside Henry James, Edgar Allan Poe. Fortunately for us, Ray's career doesn't end here. It goes on for another, 60 or 70 years. As I say, we're just over halfway through 1943, but given the colossal quantity and quality of stories Ray published in this one year, this seems like a decent place to pause. In the next episode of Bradbury 100, I'd like to read you the original version of The Wind. If you know the version of the story published in Dark Carnival or The October Country, this will give you a chance to experience the original version with its simplified point of view. And if you haven't read Dark Carnival or October Country recently, well, you've got some time to go out and read it right now. So, The Wind is the next episode, and after that I'll continue with the rest of Chronological Bradbury 1943. Thanks for listening. See you next time for The Wind. Bradbury 100 is presented and produced by Phil Nichols, and theme music is by Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com. You can find the show notes and much more on Bradbury at bradburymedia.co.uk. And please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101, where we discuss the past, present and future of science fiction. You'll find it wherever good pods are given away.